Canada, a people's history. Proudly presented with the corporate partnership support of Sun Life Financial and by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Grey Coat Charity School in the heart of London, England. David Thompson's widowed mother sent him here when he was just 7 years old. The Welsh boy is skilled in mathematics, but his passion is adventure stories. He dreams of a world beyond the school walls. He has spent half his life at the charity school when he is selected by the Hudson's Bay Company to work as a clerk in the faraway fur trade.
In the month of May 1784, at the port of London, I embarked in the ship Prince Rupert belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company as apprentice and clerk to the said company, bound for Churchill Factory on the west side of the bay.
David Thompson is 14 years old when he arrives on the bleak shores of Hudson Bay. 2 weeks later, he watches the Prince Rupert leave without him.
While the ship remained at anchor, from my parent and friends it appeared only a few weeks' distance. But when the ship sailed and from the top of the rocks I lost sight of her, the distance became immeasurable, and I bid a long and sad farewell to my noble, my sacred country, an exile forever.
David Thompson will never return to England. His destiny will be in the Canadian Northwest, in the footsteps of coureurs de bois, whose grand schemes created competing fur trade empires, and trailblazers who trekked across the barrens and dreamed of reaching a great sea to the west. Voyageurs, business tycoons, and their native trading partners. It was an age of adventure, of great daring and enterprise, of pioneers and pathfinders. The story of the fur trade and the opening of a continent. New France in the 1650s. Great Britain's dominance of the Northwest fur trade begins with a most unlikely pair. Two coureurs de bois, or French fur traders, Médard Chouard de Groseilliers and his flamboyant brother-in-law, Pierre Esprit Radisson.
It was my destiny to discover many wild nations. I would not strive against that destiny. For my own part, I will venture, choosing to die like a man than live like a beggar.
Radisson is a free spirit. He was kidnapped by Mohawks as a teenager and adopted by one of their families. He went on hunts and war parties. He even survived torture. Once he escaped the captivity of the Mohawks, he was not going to be bound by the rules and regulations of New France.
We were Caesars, there being nobody to contradict us.
In the 1650s, New France relies on the fur trade with natives. Fortunes are made feeding Europe's craving for beaver felt hats. But the land to the west remains a mystery. Radisson and his brother-in-law want to expand the trade to the most distant Great Lake.
We made our proposition to the governor of Quebec, that we were willing to venture our lives for the good of the country, and to go to travel to the remotest countries with 2 years.
The authorities in New France don't trust Radisson. The governor insists he and de Groseilliers take along 2 inexperienced functionaries as watchdogs.
We made the governor a slight answer and told him for our part we knew what we were. Discoverers before governors. The governor was much displeased at this and commanded us not to go without his leave.
To Radisson, such a command has the ring of a dare. In the dead of night, he and de Groseilliers head out. They reach the shores of Lake Superior with winter approaching. Local natives tell them that if they wait until spring, they can join a great feast and trading ceremony. So they make camp for the winter. Food is so scarce, they eat bark, roots, even their own clothes. When spring finally arrives, so does the opportunity. Hundreds of natives from 18 nations gather for the traditional Feast of the Dead, and they welcome the French fur traders.
We sang in our language as they in theirs, to which they gave great attention. We gave them several gifts and received many. They bestowed upon us above 300 robes of castors.
The castors, or beaver pelts, are thick and lustrous. Radisson is told they come from northern rivers, and those rivers possibly lead to a great saltwater bay. The 2 coureurs de bois paddle home with the news of this rich, untapped source of furs and a possible supply route, certain they will get support for another expedition. But the governor finds them both and throws de Groseilliers in jail.
He made my brother a prisoner for not having observed his orders and to be gone without his leave. Was not he a tyrant to deal so with us after we had so hazarded our lives?
After repeated rejections in Quebec and in France, Radisson and de Groseilliers broach treason. They take their plan to the court of France's rival, England. The coureurs de bois tell King Charles II that Britain can control the richest fur grounds in North America if it sets up a series of trading posts where the rivers flow into Hudson Bay. On May 2nd, 1670, with the stamp of the royal seal, King Charles II creates a monopoly over 3 million square miles of land. The Hudson's Bay Company, the Honorable Company of Adventurers is born.
We have given, granted, and confirmed unto the said Governor and Company the sole trade and commerce of all those seas, straits, bays, rivers, lakes, creeks, and sounds. We do make, create, and constitute the said Governor and Company the true and absolute lords and proprietors of the same territory.
Radisson is not made one of the lords and proprietors of Hudson Bay. After switching allegiances several times between England and France, he will die in poverty. But his daring idea creates what will become the most profitable fur trading company in the world. A dream of reaching the Great Western Sea drives New France and the French fur trade into the western interior. It is the obsession of Pierre de la Vérendrye, a loyal servant to the French crown and a very different man than the unruly Pierre Radisson. 50 years after the Hudson's Bay Company was formed, La Vérendrye follows ancient native trading routes, pursuing a passage to the elusive sea.
I acquainted myself with the route through different savages who all made the same statement. 3 routes, or rivers, lead to the great river of the West. I had a map made of these 3 rivers in order that I might be able to choose the shortest and easiest route.
He presents his map to the governor of New France with a persuasive argument.
The colony will receive a new benefit, independently of the discovery of the Western Sea, through the quantity of furs that will be produced, which now go to the English.
The authorities in New France do not turn down this proposition. In June 1731, the former soldier sets off with military discipline and purpose. The party of 50 includes his 3 sons.
I am only seeking to carry the name and arms of His Majesty into a vast stretch of countries hitherto unknown, to enlarge the colony and increase its commerce.
He sets up 8 western trading posts. The French traders will still have to endure the long trip back to Montreal, but they can intercept the best furs before the native trappers go to Hudson Bay. It is an intrepid family. 2 of his sons actually reach the foothills of the Rockies, but not the Great Western Sea. That dream goes unfulfilled, and La Vérendrye's heroic life turns tragic. To forge alliances with Cree and Blackfoot along the trade routes, he allows his son, Jean-Baptiste, and some of his men to join a war party against the Sioux.
I was agitated, I must confess, and cruelly tormented by conflicting thoughts, but put on a brave front. How was I to entrust my eldest son to barbarians whom I did not know, to go and fight against other barbarians of whose name and of whose strength I knew nothing? Who could tell whether my son would ever return? They were all massacred by the Sioux in the most treacherous manner. In that calamity, I lost my son and all my Frenchmen, to my lifelong regret.
La Vérendrye returns to Montreal a celebrated explorer, but a defeated man. He faces creditors, lawsuits, and crushing sorrow over the death of his son.
People do not know me. Money has never been my object. I have sacrificed myself and my sons for the service of His Majesty and the good of the colony. What advantages shall result from my toils, only the future may tell.
The future did tell. La Vérendrye has found the Achilles heel of the Hudson's Bay Company, a backdoor route leading to the heart of fur country. And that launches a battle for mastery of the West that will last 100 years. (1784). The English are strategically positioned on Hudson Bay when 14-year-old David Thompson begins his 7-year apprenticeship.
A small room was allotted to me, without the least article of furniture, but a hard bed for the night. My fellow clerks were in the same situation. They were not comfortable, but resigned, and I had to become so.
The Welsh boy is hardly prepared for his first winter on Hudson Bay.
The cold is so intense that everything in a manner is shivered by it. All our movements, more or less, were for self-preservation. All the wood that could be collected for fuel gave us only one fire in the morning and another in the evening. The rest of the day, if bad weather, we had to walk in the guard room with our heavy coats of dressed beaver.
But with the arrival of spring, the trading posts come alive as flotillas of canoes arrive with the winter supplies of furs. In the best years, the native trappers and hunters unload more than 100,000 animal pelts. The Cree trading captain's scarlet tunic is a gift from the company factor. And the trading captain leads the negotiations for the Cree. Clerks like David Thompson keep meticulous accounts of the goods the company trades with the natives. No money changes hands. The beaver is the standard of currency. One blanket costs 7 pelts, and a gun, 14.
The goods taken were of great utility to the Indians. Everything is carried on by barter, profitable to both parties, but more so to the Indians than to us. We took from them furs of no use to them.
David Thompson becomes fascinated by the natives who come to trade. In his early years at Churchill, he travels along the coastline. He learns the Cree language and the natives' ways of survival.
Every day we passed from 12 to 15 polar bears lying on the marsh a short distance from the shore. The Indian rule is to walk past them with a steady step without seeming to notice them.
His young mind is awakened by the land and its people.
By what means do these wild geese make such long journeys with such precision of place? The wise and learned civilized man answers, by instinct. But what is instinct? The Indian believes the geese are directed by the Manitou who has care of them. Which of the two is right?
David Thompson's wonderment will also be fueled by a story he learns at Churchill of an expedition to a world beyond. Samuel Hearne is an eccentric. The chief factor at Churchill befriends animals found around the fort. His favorite pets are beavers, the very animals they are supposed to be killing.
They became so domesticated as to answer their name and follow in the same manner as a dog would do. And they were as much pleased at being fondled as any animal I ever saw. During the winter, they lived on the same food as the women, and they were remarkably fond of rice and plum pudding.
The company indulges Hearne's eccentricities, and David Thompson discovers why. In his first year at Churchill, Thompson is assigned to transcribe Hearne's travel journals, a story of an incredible trek across half a continent. 15 years earlier, Samuel Hearne left Churchill and headed northwest. He crossed the frozen tundra in search of a rumored copper mine. The expedition was led by the Dene leader Matonabbee, a man whose skill in northern travel impressed the much younger Samuel Hearne.
I found my new acquaintance on all occasions the most sociable, kind, and sensible Indian I had ever met with. He was a man well known, and as an Indian, of universal knowledge and generally respected.
Matonabbee stipulated that the expedition had to include women.
He said, when all the men are heavy laden, they can neither hunt nor travel to any considerable distance. Women are made for labor. One of them can carry or haul as much as 2 men do.
Hearne lived off the land. They hunted caribou and muskox, often eating the animals raw. The expedition covered up to 15 miles a day. 6 months into the trip, as summer approached, Hearne encountered Copper Indians, natives who had never seen a European before.
They found and pronounced me to be a perfect human being, except in the color of my hair and eyes. The whiteness of my skin also was, in their opinion, no ornament. As they said, it resembled meat which had been sodden in water till all the blood was extracted.
The expedition was just a few miles from its destination, the copper mines, when they found an Inuit camp. The Inuit were ancient rivals of Matonabbee and his people. Hearne's native guides prepared an attack.
The Indians crept under some of the rocks within 100 yards of the tents, where they lay some time to watch the motions of the Eskimo. But finding all asleep, they ran on the tent on a sudden. Killed every soul before they had power to rise. In the whole, 21 persons.
Hearn named the massacre scene Bloody Falls. And the words in his journal turned from revulsion to deep disappointment and despair. 7 months after setting off from Churchill, Samuel Hearn reached the copper mines and learned a terrible truth.
This mine, if it deserved that appellation, is no more than an entire jumble of rocks and gravel. I and almost all my companions expended near 4 hours in search of some of this metal. Amongst us all, only one piece of any size could be found.
But Samuel Hearn will still return a hero, and David Thompson will soon be living adventures of his own. The fur trade is set to enter its most turbulent era. The competing systems are entrenched. The Hudson's Bay Company remains in posts along the bay's coastline, and the natives bring their furs to them. While French traders travel from Montreal into the interior to trade directly with the natives. The English system and the French. But it all changes in 1759. With the conquest of New France, a new group of Americans, English, and Highland Scots take over the French trade routes. At first, the Hudson's Bay Company dismisses them as mere peddlers, until a group of the Montreal merchants pool resources and form the Northwest Company. It is powerful, aggressive, and profitable. Now the Hudson's Bay Company has real competition. Within 15 years of incorporation, the Nor'westers control almost 80% of the fur trade and are reporting huge earnings. One of the shareholders is Montreal's James McGill.
Your friends of the Northwest are making a larger outfit this year than they did last. Their great success last year enables them to undertake anything, and I make no doubt they will continue successful.
McGilvray, McTavish, Mackenzie, Frobisher. These men are the adventurers, traveling the fur trade routes themselves from Montreal, meeting with the wintering partners and clerks who man the trading posts deep into the Northwest. They gather at the gateway between the East and the West, Grand Portage. Every year, the Northwest Company hosts a rendezvous at Grand Portage before its annual meeting. A Highland dance where everyone celebrates the year's work. These Montreal merchants and backwoods traders are threatening the Hudson's Bay Company's century-old monopoly. At Hudson's Bay headquarters in London, the Honourable Company is forced to react.
We are quite satisfied that the decrease of our trade is owing to the upland Indians being intercepted by the peddlers, who by means of a chain of rivers and lakes are got up to the back of many of our factories. But we are equally satisfied that this traffic might, in a short time, be got the better of by sending some of our servants from each of our factories to those lakes or rivers and opening a trade with the natives in the same manner they do.
The Hudson's Bay Company resolves to meet the competition head-on. Ambitious clerks will get the opportunity to leave the coastline and head into the mysterious continent. David Thompson is one of the 46 baymen sent west to build Hudson's Bay Company posts inland and establish trade in the foothills of the Rockies. The teenager is awestruck as he travels through the open prairie and beyond.
At length, the Rocky Mountains came in sight like shining white clouds on the horizon. As we proceeded, they rose in height. Their immense masses of snow appeared above the clouds and formed an impassable barrier, even to the eagle.
In the shadow of the Rockies, the fur traders encounter an encampment of pagan Indians, a thriving community of buffalo hunters. Young David Thompson spends the winter with Saukamapi, a pagan elder. They converse in Cree.
Almost every evening for the time of 4 months, I sat and listened to the old man without being in the least tired. The habits, customs and manners, politics and religion such as it was, anecdotes of the Indian chiefs and the means of their gaining influence in war and peace, that I always found something to interest me.
Saukamapi tells him of a pagan scouting party. The scouts came upon a camp. It was their old enemy, the Snake Indians.
Our scouts were out for our security when some returned and informed us of a considerable camp, which was too large to attack, and something very suspicious about it.
The camp seemed deserted. The scouts suspected a trap. But they attacked.
With our sharp, flat daggers and knives, we cut through the tents and entered for the fight. But our war whoop instantly stopped. Our eyes were appalled with terror. There was no one to fight but the dead and the dying.
It was smallpox. The pagans stripped the dead of their infected possessions and went home, carrying the virus with them.
The second day after, this dreadful disease broke out in our camp and spread from one tent to another, as if the bad spirit carried it. We had no belief that one man could give it to another, any more than a wounded man could give his wound to another.
A third of Salkamapi's people died of the smallpox they contracted.
When at length it left us, and we moved about to find our people, it was no longer with a song and a dance, but with tears, shrieks, and howlings of despair for those who would never return to us. We believed the good spirit had forsaken us and allowed the bad spirit to become our master.
In the 1700s, smallpox epidemics brought by unsuspecting European traders killed half the native peoples across the West. The fur trade continues its relentless growth. In 1800, the Northwest Company is at the peak of its success. Freighter canoes destined for grand portage leave Montreal loaded with trade goods, provisions, and human cargo. Daniel Harmon comes from a staunchly religious family in Vermont, but declares he has a roving disposition.
Yesterday, in company with several other clerks, I left Montreal, and I am thus far on my way to the Indian countries.
Daniel Harmon is destined for the northwestern fur trade, but for now, he and the other clerks, traders, and partners can sit back. The voyageurs do the paddling. The scholarly Harmon does not find them engaging company.
They're great talkers, but in the utmost sense of the word, thoughtless. All of their chat is about horses, dogs, canoes, and women, and strong men who can fight a good battle. The voyageurs make very indifferent companions, and with whom I cannot associate.
Strong, young French Canadians. The voyageurs should be no taller than 5 feet 6 inches to leave room for cargo. Their daily hot meal is a stew of pork fat and peas, which earns them the nickname Les Mangeurs de l'Art. Men like François Forcier of Sarel and Louis Bolac of Saint-Ours are paid much more than they could ever make at home on the farm, and they earn it. There are 38 portages between Montreal and Grand Portage. And even Daniel Harmon is impressed by their brute strength.
Since yesterday morning, we have come about 60 miles and passed 2 rapids, where most of the property was taken out of the canoes and carried across the portages on people's backs. These young men, who have never been in the Indian countries, now began to regret that they had enlisted into this service, which requires them, as they say, to carry burdens like horses, when by remaining in their own country, they might have labored like men.
It is not only backbreaking. Few of the voyageurs can swim, and the rivers are treacherous.
At almost every rapid that we have passed since we left Montreal, we have seen a number of crosses erected. And at one, I saw no less than 30.
Joseph Grenier writes to his son using the only address he has, Pays d'en haut, the upper country.
My dear son, this is the 3rd letter I have sent since receiving your letter 5 years ago. We are praying that you will not abandon us, that you will come back soon, because we are old and would love to see you before we die.
The old man's letters go unanswered. More than 6 weeks after leaving Montreal, the canoes approach Grand Portage. The voyageurs have paddled and portaged 1,000 miles. In 2 weeks, they will do the same trip again, back to Montreal, loaded with furs. A month after reaching Grand Portage, Daniel Harmon and his party head west. Deep into the heart of Cree and Assiniboine country.
When we got within a mile of the natives' camp, 10 or a dozen of the chiefs and most respected men came on horseback to meet and conduct us to their dwellings.
If he was apprehensive about living among the natives, he is surprised.
During several days that we remained with those people, we were met with more real politeness than is often shown to strangers in the civilized part of the world, and much more than I'd expected to meet with from savages, as the Indians are generally called, but I think wrongfully.
Daniel Harmon is now a wintering clerk, a fur trader 1,000 miles northwest of Grand Portage. Life at times is exciting, but for the most part, isolating and lonely. Most winterers find companionship with native women. Country marriages, as they are called, cement trading alliances. 2 years into his stay, a Cree chief offers Daniel Harmon one of his daughters.
He pressed me to keep her. He said he was fond of me and he wished to have his daughter with the white people. And he almost persuaded me to accept of her. For I was sure that while I had the daughter, I should not only have the father's hunts, but those of his relations also. But thanks be to God that I wasn't brought into a snare laid no doubt by the devil himself.
When Harmon receives another offer 3 years later, he accepts and enters into a country marriage with the 14-year-old daughter of a French-Canadian voyageur and a native mother, Lisette Duval.
My intentions now are to keep her as long as I remain in this uncivilized part of the world. But when I return to my native land, I shall endeavor to place her into the hands of some good, honest man, with whom she can pass the remainder of her days in this country.
His young wife turns out to be more than just a companion who facilitates trade. Together, he and Lisette have 12 children. The Harmons educate the girls at home, but send their son George back east for a more formal education. But just 2 years later, tragic news.
I found several letters from my brothers, which announced the most grievous and truly heart-rending tidings. That my beloved son George was no more to be numbered among the living.
Daniel Harmon spends 19 years with the Northwest Company, serving in posts all across the West. When it comes time to retire, he could leave his country wife behind, but the bonds they have forged are too strong to break.
We have wept together over the early departure of several children, and especially over the death of a beloved son. We have children still living, who are equally dear to us both. How could I spend my days in a civilized world and leave my beloved children in the wilderness? The thought has in it the bitterness of death.
Lisette travels to Montreal with her husband and they are legally married. Their children, of European and native blood, become part of a new Canadian people, the Métis. (1788), 2 days before David Thompson's 5th Christmas in Canada.
On coming down a rude, steep bank, I fell and broke the large bone of my right leg and had to be hauled home, which, by the mercy of God, turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me.
As his shattered leg slowly heals, Philip Turner, the Hudson's Bay Company's chief surveyor, begins teaching him the art and science of surveying.
Mr. Turner was well versed in mathematics. Under him, I regained my mathematical education and during the winter became his only assistant, and thus learned practical astronomy under an excellent master of the science.
Surveying is the key to map-making, and map-making is the key that will unlock the continent for the Europeans. Thompson thrives on its rigorous discipline.
The mean of the foregoing observations places Cumberland House in latitude 53 degrees 56.44 north, longitude 102.13 west of Greenwich, and the variation of the transits of the sun and a well-regulated watch is 11 degrees 30 east.
Astronomy so consumes him that he sometimes ignores his well-being.
By too much attention to calculations in the night with no other light than a small candle, my right eye became so much inflamed that I lost its sight.
He regains his sight, and when his apprenticeship ends, instead of the customary reward of a new suit of clothes, he asks the company's governors for his own set of surveying instruments. He gets both. David Thompson's life has found its purpose. Over the next 2 decades, he will chart the vast Northwest. By studying the movements of the planets, he will become known as the man who looks at stars.
Both Canadians and Indians often inquire of me why I observed the sun and sometimes the moon in the daytime, and passed whole nights with my instruments looking at the moon and stars. I told them it was to determine the distance and direction from the place I observed to other places. And neither the Canadians nor the Indians believed me, for they argued that if what I said was truth, then I ought to look to the ground and over it, and not to the stars.
David Thompson will become one of the greatest map makers and geographers who ever lived. A man who was never a remarkable surveyor will become the fur trade's most celebrated explorer. The Northwest Company's Alexander Mackenzie knows that the first man across the continent will not just extend trade to China and Russia. He will become a hero. Bored with life in a Northwest Company trading post, Mackenzie combines ambition, resolve, and arrogance.
I'm off to traffic with the Russians. Should I be successful, I shall retire to greater advantage. Should I be unsuccessful, I cannot be worse off than I am at present.
Mackenzie tried to reach the Pacific Ocean before, but followed a river to the Arctic. May 1793. He sets off again, up the Peace River, heading west. He encounters rough water almost from the start and repeatedly has to tow the fragile canoe against the rushing water.
The agitation of the water was so great that a wave striking on the bow of the canoe broke the line and filled us with inexpressible dismay. It appeared impossible that the vessel could escape from being dashed to pieces, and those who were in her from perishing.
Still, he continues pursuing a river route for almost a month. Local natives tell him he can only reach the Pacific by going overland. Eventually, Mackenzie relents and rallies his exhausted crew.
I declared in the most solemn manner that I would not abandon my design of reaching the sea if I made the attempt alone, and that I did not despair of returning in safety to my friends.
The overland journey goes smoothly. The native peoples who live in the mountains have well-established trading routes that lead west. And they guide him to a saltwater channel. Tide marks on the rocks prove that it leads to the Pacific Ocean. But at his very moment of triumph, Mackenzie faces chaos and near catastrophe. Angry coastal natives surround his expedition. He is told that if his party continues to the open water, they will be killed. His guide begs him to flee.
In relating our danger, his agitation was so violent that he foamed at the mouth. My people were panic-struck. Some of them asked if it was my determination to remain there to be sacrificed.
Mackenzie has traveled too far to leave before he can prove that he has made it to salt water.
I now mixed up some vermilion in melted grease and inscribed in large characters this brief memorial. Alexander Mackenzie, from Canada by land, the 22nd of July, 1793.
Mackenzie becomes the toast of London with the publication of his immensely popular memoirs. Napoleon is an admirer, and the American president Thomas Jefferson is inspired to send the Lewis and Clark expedition across the United States. Mackenzie is knighted, becomes rich, and a hero. His ambitions are met. But his route is of no commercial value to the Northwest Company. The rivers are too turbulent, the mountain paths too steep. The task of finding a passage that traders can actually use will fall to another pathfinder, David Thompson. In the early 1800s, the Northwest is in transition. New people have new designs on the fur trade. An entrepreneur from New York City, an aristocrat from Scotland, and a man they call the Little Emperor, who will rule Canada's northern rivers like a tyrant. The offspring of traders and natives will go to battle as the fur trade competition turns to war. The fur traders' empire will give way to gold miners and farmers, and a new world will take shape. In the late 1700s, the former apprentice from the charity school in London is now a surveyor and explorer for the Hudson's Bay Company. David Thompson keeps meticulous notes and observations along the many trails about the landscape, the vegetation, and especially his partners in the fur trade, the peoples of the West.
On becoming acquainted with the Indians, I found almost every character in civilized society can be traced among them. From the gravity of a judge to a merry jester, from open-hearted generosity to the avaricious miser.
But the trade with the natives is turning vicious and ugly. The amount of liquor traded more than doubles as competition between the Nor'westers and the Baymen intensifies. David Thompson is one of the few fur traders to defy convention.
I made it a law to myself that no alcohol should pass the mountains in my company, and thus be clear of the sad sight of drunkenness and its many evils. But these gentlemen insisted upon alcohol, being the most profitable article that could be taken for the Indian trade. In this, I knew they had miscalculated.
Thompson has been with the Hudson's Bay Company for 13 years, and he is becoming frustrated and restless. While Nor'westers like Alexander Mackenzie are achieving fame and great fortune, Thompson is ordered to stop surveying, return to Hudson Bay, and focus on fur trading. In 1797, he chooses a different option.
Tuesday, set off. This day left the service of the Hudson's Bay Company and entered that of the Company of Merchants from Canada. May God Almighty prosper me.
He walks 80 miles in the snow to the nearest Northwest Company post. The Nor'westers offer him more money, more opportunity, and they encourage him to fill the missing portions of his emerging map of the Northwest. Now he feels he is with the real adventurers.
How very different the liberal and public spirit of this Northwest Company of Merchants from Canada from the mean, selfish policy of the Hudson's Bay Company. Styled, honorable.
And so begin his greatest years of exploring. David Thompson will continue his extraordinary Western travels. Alexander Mackenzie once said that Thompson accomplished more in 10 months than he would have thought possible in 2 years. But David Thompson's most celebrated trip still lies before him. By 1810, David Thompson has built Northwest Company trading posts and pioneered routes deep into the Rocky Mountains. He is about to go on leave when he receives new orders. He is to head to the Pacific Ocean.
The critical situation of our affairs in the Columbia obliged me to return there. I am getting tired of such constant, hard journeys. For the last 20 months I have spent only bare 2 months under the shelter of a hut. All the rest has been in my tent, and there is little likelihood the next 12 months will be much otherwise.
The situation is critical because the Americans are heading to the Pacific. New York City is the headquarters of John Jacob Astor's Pacific Fur Company. The most powerful businessman in the United States plans to build a trading post at the mouth of the mightiest river leading into the Pacific, the Columbia. In September 1810, Astor's ship, the Tonquin, set sail on a voyage around Cape Horn to the Columbia River. Meanwhile, David Thompson is sent overland to secure the Nor'westers' interests. Trouble begins almost immediately. Thompson and a small party are on horseback. They plan to meet the rest of the expedition traveling by canoe. They are in Piegan territory. The Piegan are furious with the Nor'westers for supplying their enemies with guns. When Thompson arrives at the rendezvous point, there are no canoes.
I thought some accident had happened. I told Mr. Henry to proceed through the woods, down the river in search of the canoes and see what detained them, with positive orders not to fire a shot, but in self-defense.
But one of William Henry's men disobeys. Now the Piegan can track them down.
I told them that they had acted very foolishly, that the Piegan Indians would be on us very early in the morning, and that we must start at the dawn of day and ride for our lives.
They ride until dark, not knowing whether they are being followed.
We made a small fire and passed the night with some anxiety. My situation precluded sleep. Cut off from my men, uncertain where to find them, and equally so of the movements of the Indians, I was at a loss what to do, or which way to proceed. Morning came, and I had to determine what course to take. After being much perplexed whether to take to the defiles of the mountains or try to find my men in canoes, I determined that finding my men was of the most importance.
Eventually, he does connect with his missing men, but the Piegan have blockaded his planned route through the mountains. With winter closing in, he has to detour hundreds of miles north toward the Athabasca River, into territory he has never charted, facing a new threat: avalanches.
We must now change our route to the defiles of the Athabasca River, which would place us in safety, but will be attended with great inconvenience, fatigue, suffering, and privation. But there was no alternative.
In the deep snow, they have to abandon their horses and rely on dog sleds. While Thompson struggles in the Athabasca Pass, the Tonquin rounds Cape Horn. It is now only a matter of weeks before John Jacob Astor's men reach the Columbia. And Thompson is still climbing.
January 9th, hauling very bad. The weather so mild that the snow is dropping from the trees and everything wet. We could proceed only about 4 miles. The snow is full 7 feet deep, the dogs often sunk in it, but our snowshoes did not sink more than 3 inches.
No matter what hardships his men endure during the day, every clear evening, David Thompson takes mathematical readings. While inching across the mountains, the man who looks at stars is studying infinity and precisely charting his journey. Finally, after 3 months, David Thompson and his men reach the crest of the mountains.
My men admired the brilliancy of the stars, and as one of them said, he thought he could almost touch them with his hand. As usual, when the fire was made, I set off to examine the country before us. Many reflections came to my mind. A new world was, in a manner, before me.
The Athabasca Pass. David Thompson's route through the mountains will be used by fur traders for half a century. But for now, Thompson's party can go no further. They are snowbound, stuck for the rest of the winter. Meanwhile, the Tonquin arrives at the mouth of the Columbia River, and Astor's men start building a fort. When the pass is clear in the spring, David Thompson sets off down the Columbia, methodically establishing trading alliances along the way.
My reason for putting ashore with the natives is to make friends with them against my return. For in descending the current of a large river, we might pass on without much attention to them, but on returning against the current, our progress will be slow and close along the shore, and consequently very much in their power.
And he claims the territory he passes for his country and company.
Here I erected a small pole with half a sheet of paper well tied about it with these words on it. Know hereby that this country is claimed by Great Britain as part of its territories, and that the Northwest Company of Merchants from Canada do hereby intend to erect a factory on this place for the commerce of the country around.
But when Thompson arrives at the mouth of the Columbia, the American flag is already flying over Fort Astoria. The land will be bought, sold, and contested, but will eventually become Oregon. Still, it is a personal triumph. David Thompson has found a viable trade route and crossed the continent. He has reached the Pacific Ocean.
Thus, I have fully completed the survey of this part of North America. From sea to sea, and by almost innumerable astronomical observations, have determined the positions of the mountains, lakes, and rivers, and other remarkable places on the northern part of this continent.
David Thompson will now take his survey notes and observations and start work on his master project, a map of the Great Northwest. The Northwest Company is overextended. By 1810, the Montreal merchants have hundreds of fur trade posts in the far reaches of the continent. Their very success puts them in peril because of the long journey from the outlying fur country back to Montreal. The plains near Lake Winnipeg, where the Red and Assiniboine rivers join, are crucial to the Nor'westers' survival. Their long expeditions depend on dried buffalo meat, pemmican. These lands are the Northwest Company's food depot. The Northwest Company's buffalo hunters are Métis, descendants of traders and natives. To these children of the fur trade, this is Northwest Company domain and their homeland. But technically, the Hudson's Bay Company owns the land, and the Nor'westers are squatters. The land along the Red River could be sold, and in 1811 it is. Lord Selkirk, a caring but somewhat impractical aristocrat, decides to settle the land with impoverished farmers, mainly from his native Scotland. The philanthropist buys a third of Hudson's Bay Company shares and 116,000 square miles along the Red River. Lord Selkirk has never been there, but that doesn't diminish his dream of a homeland for the poor and the dispossessed.
Every person of any intelligence or skill in agriculture who has visited this country has been struck with the extraordinary fertility of the soil, the facility of cultivation, and the abundance of its spontaneous productions.
The Northwest Company calls Selkirk's scheme mad. Simon McGilvery puts it simply.
He must be driven to abandon it, for his success would strike at the very existence of our trade.
Fields and fences will threaten the Nor'westers' food supply and trade routes. Settlement will inevitably provoke confrontation. After a 2-month trip across the ocean and 50 days rowing upstream from Hudson Bay, the first Selkirk settlers approach Red River. To them, this is the promised land. They were assured that a settlement has been built and is ready for them. Hector McEachern, John McVicker, and Alexander McLean, whose wife delivered a son on the 4-month voyage. They arrive to distressing news. The settlement isn't ready. They have to take their possessions south by land to find shelter before the winter sets in. In Scotland, the Northwest Company has tried to undermine the settlement, scaring the settlers with tales of warlike natives. In fact, it is the natives who lead the first settlers south to their camp for the winter. To Peguis, the Ojibwa chief, this is neither Northwest Company nor Hudson's Bay Company territory. It can be shared.
These are not my lands. They belong to our great father. For it is only he who gives us the means of our existence. For what would become of us if he left us to ourselves? We would wither like the grass on the plains.
The following spring, the Selkirk settlers go back to Red River. The first European farmers on the Canadian prairies start building a new life in a new land. The Métis and the Nor'westers can coexist with a few settlers. But if they keep coming, the buffalo hunter's way of life is doomed. And they do keep coming. Each year after 1812, a new group of settlers, and each year they arrive too late to plant crops. The Selkirk settlers are starving, struggling to survive. The Hudson's Bay Company governor takes desperate action. Miles MacDonnell issues the Pemmican Proclamation, banning the export of food from Red River, preventing the Northwest Company from supplying its trading posts. It is MacDonnell's first act of provocation.
It is hereby ordered that no persons trading in furs or provisions within the territory shall take out any provisions, either of flesh, fish, game, or vegetables. Whosoever shall be detected in attempting to carry out any provisions shall be taken into custody and prosecuted.
Then MacDonnell orders the Northwest Company to leave Hudson's Bay Company land. The Nor'westers respond immediately and bluntly. Their agent in Red River is Duncan Cameron.
MacDonnell is now determined not only to seize our pemmican, but to drive us out of the Assiniboia district, and consequently out of the Northwest. Hostilities will no doubt begin early this spring.
Duncan Cameron calls the Métis buffalo hunters to a meeting at Fort Gibraltar, the Northwest Company's post in Red River, or Assiniboia, as Cameron calls it. He tells them they are a new nation, a distinct people, facing enslavement by the settlers.
You must assist me in driving away the colony. If they are not drove away, the consequences will be they will prevent you from hunting. They will starve your families. They will put their feet in the neck of those that attempt to resist them. You can easily see how they mean to finish, by what they have begun already.
Cameron urges the Métis to destroy the settlement. He devises guerrilla tactics. The Métis are to put on war paint and burn out the settlers. John Pritchard's home is barely a year old when it is attacked.
They immediately began to burn down our houses in the daytime and fire upon us during the night, saying the country was theirs. If we did not immediately quit the settlement, they would plunder us of our property and burn the houses over our heads.
Violence breaks out in trading posts across the West. In June 1816, at a place called Seven Oaks in Red River, 28 baymen and settlers confront 61 Métis and natives. When it is all over, 21 baymen and 1 native lie dead. In Britain, the Colonial Office calls for a truce. Amalgamation seems the only answer. In 1821, exhausted by the violence and impoverished by relentless expansion, the Northwest Company agrees to a merger. Two great companies have disputed the possession of the West for half a century. Now they join forces under the name of the Hudson's Bay Company. The long fight is over. The Selkirk settlers have begun a new era. The West will never be the same. The fur trade war is decreed over in the boardroom, but peace has not been declared in the backcountry. Making amalgamation work falls to a man they call the Little Emperor, the Hudson's Bay Company's George Simpson. He takes to the job with ruthless efficiency.
It is high time the system should be changed, and I think there's ample field for reform and amendment.
Dinner at York Factory, 1821. The bitter taste of amalgamation still lingers over the fur trade. Simpson calls former Nor'westers and baymen together. 2 of the guests once fought a duel, as trader John Todd remembers.
They had hacked and slashed at each other with swords only a few months before. One of them still bore the marks of a cut on his face, the other, it was said, on some less conspicuous part of his body. I shall never forget the look of utter scorn and utter defiance with which they regarded each other, the moment their eyes met.
The message from the dinner is unmistakable. The 2 sides may never come to love each other, but they must work together. Simpson also makes it clear who is in charge. Then the streamlining begins.
I intended devoting this ensuing winter to a tour of Colombia, where the broom and the pruning knife, I believe, are much required.
With hand-picked paddlers and clerks, the Little Emperor races through the river systems, reshaping and reorganizing the Hudson's Bay Company's domain. In 6 years, he gets rid of half the employees and closes 73 posts. He is as caustic as he is callous.
The Columbia Department, from the day of its origin to the present hour, has been neglected, shamefully mismanaged, and a scene of the most wasteful extravagance and the most unfortunate dissension.
His enemies call him a tyrant, and he has words for them in a secret diary he calls his character book.
Colin Robertson, a frothy, trifling, conceited man who would starve in any other country and is perfectly useless here. John Clark, a boasting, ignorant, low fellow who rarely speaks the truth and is strongly suspect of dishonesty. His commanding appearance and pompous manner, however, give him a good deal of influence over Indians and servants. John Rowand. Although his education has been defective, a very clear-headed, clever fellow, will not tell a lie, which is very uncommon in this country, but has sufficient address to evade the truth when it suits his purpose.
The cuts go to the very heart of the 200-year relationship between the company and the natives. He does reduce by half the amount of alcohol traded, but scales down the traditional trading ceremonies.
It will be a work of time to reconcile the Indians to the new order of things. I have made it my study to examine the nature and character of them, and however repugnant it may be to our feelings, I am convinced they must be ruled with a rod of iron, to bring and keep them in a proper state of subordination.
Over the years, like many fur traders, Simpson takes several country wives. He lives with Betsy Sinclair for a year, and when he tires of her, he writes to a friend.
If you could dispose of the lady, it will be satisfactory, as she is an unnecessary and expensive appendage. I see no fun in keeping a woman without enjoying her charms, which my present rambling life does not permit me to do.
Margaret Taylor is pregnant with their third child when Simpson decides a country marriage no longer serves his career. Again, he leaves instructions, this time about the baby.
Pray, keep an eye on the commodity, and if she bring forth anything in the proper time and of the right colour, let them be taken care of. But if anything be amiss, let the whole be bundled about their business.
He goes home to London in search of a suitable wife who can raise his social profile. He settles on his cousin, the refined Frances Simpson, who at 18 is less than half his age. She is frail and stays only 2 years in the West. They move to Montreal and he continues amassing a fortune. In 1841, he is knighted. Sir George Simpson brought modern business practices to the backwoods. The Little Emperor has transformed the business of adventure. David Thompson spent almost 3 decades in the Canadian Northwest, often accompanied by his family. He married Charlotte Small, the daughter of a Cree woman and a Northwest Company trader. Together, they have 13 children. In 1812, the Thompson family heads east for a retirement full of hope and promise. David Thompson has not walked on a city street since he left London as a 14-year-old boy. He buys a house in eastern Ontario and sets to work on his master projects. a map and atlas of the Canadian Northwest. It takes him 2 years to finish his map, more than 50,000 miles of travel on paper.
Nothing less than an unremitting perseverance, bordering on enthusiasm, could have enabled me to have brought these maps to their present state. In early life, I conceived the idea of this work, and Providence has enabled me to complete, amidst various dangers, all that one man could hope to perform.
But publishers reject his atlas. The fur traders don't want to share the information on his maps, and Thompson's years of perseverance go uncelebrated. He begins feeling disillusioned, bitter, and even betrayed as politicians carve up the land he charted. He always felt the Columbia River should have been British because he had surveyed it first. But boundary decisions continually favor the Americans.
It may be said that the country thus acquired by the United States is of no importance to England. Be it so, and let England make a free gift to the states of what the latter require. History will place all these transactions in their proper light.
He takes jobs as a land surveyor, even plotting Alexander Mackenzie's estate in Montreal. He is slowly growing poor. On the river named by David Thompson for the explorer Simon Fraser, a native trapper was taking a drink of water when he reached in and found gold. On an April Sunday in 1858, citizens of Fort Victoria, a Hudson's Bay Company fur trade post on Vancouver Island, step out of the church to an astonishing sight. In the harbor, 450 prospectors have arrived from San Francisco. Victoria's population doubles in one day. In the next 4 months, 20,000 people pass through Fort Victoria on their way to the gold creeks of the mainland. James Douglas, the very proper Hudson's Bay Company chief factor, quickly assesses their character.
This body of adventurers are represented as being, with some exceptions, a specimen of the worst of the population of San Francisco. The very dregs, in fact, of society.
As American gold seekers pour into Hudson's Bay Company territory, James Douglas realizes as a fur trader he has no real authority over them. But he fears that the land the prospectors stake could become American.
If the country be thrown open to indiscriminate immigration, the interests of the empire may suffer from the introduction of a foreign population whose sympathies may be decidedly anti-British, and if the majority be Americans, strongly attached to their own country and peculiar institutions.
James Douglas takes bold action. Without authority, the fur trader acts as governor. He declares there will be no prospecting without a license. And he issues the license on behalf of Queen Victoria.
All persons who shall take from my lands within the said district any gold, metal, or ore containing gold, without being duly authorized in that behalf by Her Majesty's government, shall be prosecuted, both criminally and civilly, as the law allows.
On August the 2nd, 1858, Queen Victoria declares the Hudson's Bay Territory a British colony. She calls it British Columbia and names James Douglas its first governor. Four years later, Samuel J. Hathaway, a 30-year-old printer from San Francisco, heads up the trail, hungry for gold.
On the 17th, I and two other young men concluded to try our luck as partners. So we bought a mule together and a load of provisions, enough to last 6 weeks at least, and on the 18th took another step for the caribou.
The caribou was the site of the biggest strike. A prospector named William Barker and his partners sank a shaft deep into the ground and hit pay dirt. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were lifted from one claim. A boomtown sprang up, Barkerville, and for a while it was the biggest settlement west of Chicago and north of San Francisco. With 20 saloons, Barkerville was the Wild West in James Douglas's British Columbia. But Samuel Hathaway will never strike it rich like Billy Barker. Along the Caribou Road, his panning for gold becomes more and more desperate.
We meet many men returning already. Most of them have not been through to the Caribou. For myself, I expect nothing and try to think as little as possible about it. I am in for it now and must see it out if it takes my last dollar and leaves me dead broke in a foreign land.
His partners leave, but Hathaway won't turn back. He continues searching for gold. Finally, with winter threatening, he does find some, but he has stayed too long. He cannot get out. Samuel Hathaway is trapped in a tent on the trail, with an infection slowly crippling him.
Could not get out to work today. Tried it. Took me nearly an hour to get on my boot and hobble off 50 yards. Then I just crawled back again. It is very late in the season, and if a big snow comes within a few days, how shall I, a cripple, get out?
In the spring, another prospector finds Samuel Hathaway's journal and his frozen body. The gold frenzy lasts 8 years. By 1866, it has faded away. But the influx of dreamers like Samuel Hathaway has transformed Hudson's Bay Company land into a colony, and 5 years later, a province in what will become a new nation. By the mid-1800s, the sun is setting on the fur traders west. In the vast land of Peguis and Saucamapi, of native trappers and European fur traders, there is talk of railways and a new country that will control the northern half of the continent.
Before the whites entered our country and became residents, we had always plenty. The river teemed with all kinds of fish, and the plains were covered with buffaloes, and the woods full of deer. But now, all is gone.
The glory days of the fur trade dwindle. Aristocrats in Europe are now wearing top hats made of silk. The beaver hat, the fashion that opened the West, is going out of style. David Thompson spends his declining years trying to sell his journals, memoirs of his expeditions, of crossing mountain passes, of racing down the Columbia, of charting a continent. But people aren't interested in a retired fur trader's adventures. The 77 volumes sit unpublished in his lifetime. Now, in his 70s, he is poverty-stricken. He sells his winter coat for food, and finally his most precious possessions, his surveying tools. But the man who looks at stars could still spin tales. His daughter Charlotte remembers him sitting in his rocking chair for hours, reminiscing.
He seemed to live his life over in talking to himself aloud. Anecdotes of travels with his companions. We could hear him laugh heartily over them, with tears streaming down his cheeks.
David Thompson dies in 1857, 10 years before Confederation. Section by section, the land he charted will be plowed into farms and blossom into thriving cities. Calgary, Edmonton, and at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, Winnipeg. The days of pathfinders and trailblazers have passed. It is a new era with new challenges and new dreams. A modern Western Canada.